Yep.
It's finally happening. Cory and Cory are in room together, and we've made Brian sit.
I'm in timeout.
Over there. He's in timeout. He's not allowed. He's not allowed to be here, partly because he has a meeting in a few minutes, and mostly because McElvain said,
I'm better.
This is my show.
This is my show.
All right.
Hey, for the first time ever, I got referred to as the first Cory.
That's not true. Actually, it happens a lot.
You were the other Cory yesterday.
Yeah.
Good.
I was like, whoa.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah.
Cory introduced us to the other Cory. We were so good.
Sammy and Faith. It was Sammy and Faith, which I was like,
Oh, yeah.
I think you maybe had met them before, but
they
not
don't
as memorable.
Exactly.
Not as memorable.
They don't remember meeting me. No, man, it all depends on like who you meet first, because like our worlds overlap everywhere.
Yeah.
And people know it. So we've made the joke many times. If you're just tuning in, you don't do that in podcasts, but if you're just clicking in, that we multiply on every level, including Cory's.
Mm-hmm.
So
you also don't just click into that.
You don't have a microphone. People can't hear you. So Brian is sitting over here talking.
Bad podcasting.
Unbelievable. He said something very complimentary of me, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So we've been working through, I guess we could tell McElvain this. We kind of been working through like some of the tools, like our missionary pathway tools, and just like on the toolkit of like, all right, we've never done just like short-ish, 20-minute episodes, just focusing on the tools themselves that people can like, click in and go. So one thing that we just like harp on so much in the missionary pathway world, disciple making world, is being able to have gospel conversations, being able to have to talk spiritually about spiritual things with people. And we're so bad at it. People are like naturally kind of bad at it. And so like we just create tools to help people go through this. And it's one of the best ways to find persons of peace. Find people who are spiritually interested is actually have weird conversations with them. Yeah. And so McElvain helped really make some of these tools. And so just want to invite you in.
Yeah.
And so, maybe on a general level, what are your thoughts on gospel conversations? And then we can dive into the frog acrostic.
The frogs. Yeah.
Did you add an S?
No.
Oh.
Just
well, we need
you could
to
have
know.
multiple of the conversations.
That makes sense. Yeah. Totally. That makes sense.
What is my opinion on gospel conversation? Well, and just like relational evangelism in general, where, we walk with high school, college age students. And this is a big, big, big piece where like it's a life skill that hasn't been taught.
Yeah.
Then you go outside of that scope and you go, whoa, adults don't know that. So maybe they weren't taught that in high school, or as a kid, how to navigate those. And I don't remember somebody formally teaching me that. You usually get that through, the way you were raised or the way, potentially personality type too, introvert, extrovert. That's another piece that when we're doing this training with students, I try to speak into a lot, because I think immediately when you think conversations, the introvert checks out, where there's a fear wrapped up in it. It's like, oh man, I'm not that. And the extrovert lights up, right? And I try to, in this realm, say, hey, neither's off the hook, because overarchingly we're called to make disciples, and that requires conversation, right? And just as the extrovert can talk to too many people and there's no depth, the introvert is afraid of talking to one, but when they start in with one, the depth they can go to is really profound, right? And so I just, in general, when we walk with students and anybody in this, I just go, hey, it's a requirement, like that we start conversations. We know people's names, and it is part of loving people, and it's really hard to show love to somebody if there's never some vocalization of it or some display of it. And so I just, it's so important for students. And then I think the only other thing I'd add on that is you add COVID into this next generation and the disconnect of how to have conversations and where those conversations take place really changed. Where it's like more conversations take place. I'll have kids that won't respond to my text or pick up a phone call or call me back, but I'll send them a DM on Instagram and they'll respond to that.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay. So like there's a bunch of different nuances about how humans communicate and then interact and the spaces in which they choose to do that.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Man, that's so good. I feel like we should dive into that, but we're not going to because we don't have time.
Yeah.
But like, okay. So one of the ways in which we talk about this is we look at John 4 and we look at Jesus' conversation with the woman at the well. And we have this kind of paradigm of casual conversations, meaningful conversations, and then more spiritual conversations. And then we kind of throw in that little, like, we call it discover. So what happens at the end of that story is she goes and tells her village, and they all get to the feet of Jesus, discover more about Jesus. So we throw discover into it. But yeah, like casual, meaningful, spiritual. What are some ways that you kind of lean into that? Like, and by the way, we didn't overtly say this, you're picking this up. McElvain helps lead, 0 hour, focusing on mobilizing students, high school students and beyond, high school and college, really mainly, right? To go be disciple makers, live on mission in their schools, and reach their schools. So a lot of, between the two of us, we do hang out with a lot of young people nowadays. I hang out with a lot of people in their 20s, but we're just thinking about casual, meaningful, spiritual. What are some ways that you lean into that?
Yeah, and we even backed the train up for next gen of going, hey, how do you start a conversation?
Yeah, that's so good, man. We skip that too often.
Because that is also taken for granted, right? Where it's like, oh man, like just introducing yourself is a piece. It's like, part of the power behind the story with Zacchaeus is Jesus knows his name. So it's like, oh, like he recognizes who this is. It's a divine appointment. He knows that that's his name. And what power that speaks into somebody's life is that you know their name and you can introduce yourself, or you're at least willing to take the initial step, where that's a big one, for especially kids, where it's like, if we don't, and there's obviously so much spiritually wrapped up in that, the fear behind it, the rejection wrapped up in that, like, there's just a ton of discomfort for people, humans in general, with initiation in terms of conversation. So we start there, when we train high school kids.
And it's so good because it's not just younger people too. I mean, just think of any mission context that you feel like these are your friends. I mean, at some point there does take an intentionality. If it's starting a conversation from scratch, or if it's like trying to move into something more serious, like it does take intention. I'm not saying you can it and it's just this like fake, fabricated, all right, I'm now going to move this conversation unnaturally from here to here. But there's so many opportunities in normal conversations to move or to ask a good question or whatever, to get to something that's more intentional. And I would say that, I don't want to paint too broad of a brush, but guys really suck at it. Like, we're just not naturally people who talk intentional. Ladies, maybe a little bit more natural at just like getting to each other's lives. But I think initiation, take initiative both at the beginning, but also throughout this whole process. Right. Okay. So then now
require us to be the driver.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So we're thinking, should we dive into actually the frog acronym right now?
From there, I would say, beyond initiation, it's how, then what do you talk about? And it's around question asking, right? And so it's like being a curious person, and the number, it's some 300 odd questions.
307.
307.
According to my count, might be off.
He asks questions. He gets asked like 100 and some odd, 111 or something. And then he responds like to 3 directly, right?
Yep.
And by responds, we mean like he actually gives a direct answer.
And we're talking about Jesus, by the way, right? In case you didn't know that.
Not the Corys, Jesus.
Not the Corys.
And, I always lay that out for our trainings, because I go, it's so important for kids to understand his primary mode of evangelism was question asking. It really was being relational and getting to know people. And you can go anywhere throughout New Testament to see how really evangelism occurred. And it was really through this mode of question asking.
Yeah.
And being curious, because it shows love. It shows care, concern, and like a desire to get to know people. And then from there, it's like, you can't just say that generally, especially for where we work. It's like really developing and helping them go, what are things I can ask questions around?
That's good. Yeah.
Because if you just say, go and ask questions, like, what's your name? And that's like the end of the conversation.
Right. 100%.
You have to set people up on, what are things, hot topics potentially, or things that are important to people, that highlight aspects of their lives that you could start to see if they're leaning in more or not. Which would help in the discernment process of seeing at what stage we're at, whether it's casual, meaningful, spiritual, etc.
Yeah. I think I've heard you say, I think it was you. And if not, I'm going to give you credit because it's really wise, that, spiritual conversations don't have to be like its own topic. right? We talk about these things. We talk about football. We talk about family. We talk about spiritual things. And actually, it's more like spiritual things infiltrate all those topics, right? And so the generic ones, and I kind of want to know why you landed on frog. If it's just because you like the things, or because it's weird enough that people remember.
Yeah. I mean, I think we were thinking through the lens of like the two areas of people's lives that you start to discern whether, if they're really going to respond. Like everybody's had a conversation with somebody that introduced themselves and asked some questions, especially if you've been in youth ministry, and the kid's like, yeah, I play Roblox. All right. Like,
right.
In it, and you're like asking more questions, and they're just like in their phone ignoring you. And you're like, this is not going well. And this is a kid who's a Christian, so like, multiply that outside that circle. So I just go, you do have to tap into some reality of people's pain or their passions. And when we can find one of those two things, people tend to open up more. Wow. Right. And that's just true. And so the frog part really came out of what are the passion points or things that are pretty safe questions to ask around for anybody, literally anybody. And could that reveal some deeper things around passion or pain?
That's so good. Yeah.
So then we walked through, anybody could ask a question about what's your family like? What are the dynamics within that? And if you just took friends or family into equation from the frog, just the F out of that, you could get really deep really quick.
Yeah.
Really easily. And it could go spiritually really easily. Just asking, did you guys have any religious background would even be a simple one to go, oh yeah, we go every Christmas to this. And you can gain so much insight from just that category alone.
Absolutely. Yeah. For those of you who are on the video, so YouTube or just, the Spotify video, there are, you're seeing our document. So I'm sharing the screen, gospel conversation tools, and you can actually look at, FROG. So F, friends and family. R, recreation. O, occupation. And then G, goals and gifts. General topics of conversation, where even within that, you're saying, okay, there are casual and then there are meaningful and spiritual types of questions that you can actually be intentional. You can have kind of in your hip pocket, in a sense, ready to kind of pull out, which is a great life skill, by the way, just in general, like what you were saying earlier, to actually be able to have conversations with people, but ways that you can be like, okay, we're talking like almost everything in life can fall in these four categories in a sense. So you think through
if we're going to add an S, you can put it as sports, right? For the dudes.
I think we should. I was like, what do we learn about like the universe when we talk about Aaron Rodgers, and
there's a lot to learn.
That's a bad example, or maybe a great one. Okay. So like maybe, I don't know if you want to jump into a little bit of those categories, and then maybe some examples of casual, meaningful, spiritual conversations within those. Just give you the floor, or whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, again, all of these I think can tap into, you just take friends and family, like it can be a real pain point for a lot of people, right? Like out of the get-go, like you can hear in an instant people, how they grew up and their background and the pains and the disappointments or how they were treated. Like, and people typically want to share, if there is some leaning in, right? And you'll tell pretty quick if somebody's like not going to share around that, right? And sometimes that takes time and trust and earning and continuously asking. And so maybe the initial conversation is, in that casual space, you're just getting to know, they have two brothers and they're from a divorced home. Like that's a lot of data to know pretty quickly from somebody, but that doesn't necessarily mean you got to dive in immediately. Tell me more on a deeper level, why your parents got divorced. In an initial conversation, that may not be appropriate. There may not have been time spent with that individual and trust built for them to really openly share that. And so that's why we go, it's a starting point. Those are the casual spaces, but they obviously can be ones that you come back to. And that's why it's like helpful to remember the frog piece, because then you can go, oh man, I remember this in our relationship. And it feels like we've had enough time and trust built through shared experience or just hanging out or whatever, right? That like, I feel like I could revisit that part about their family.
Yeah.
And it feels like we're in a space that they would probably openly share, especially if you were willing to also share about the way you were raised or things in your own life. Because we always want to identify with people and wherever they're at. because we learn, we share each other's burdens. Like God designed us as humans that way to actually bear one another's burdens that are too deep for us. And family can be a major one of that. Right. And that's why it's like, I mean, I don't even know the number on it, but the amount of people that probably go to therapy and counseling for just their, God-given biological family is probably a very large percentage of people. Right.
Well, I was looking up numbers, talking with Gen Z young adults about how many in the generation in therapy in general. And like you touch on that. And I have found, especially with younger people, they actually are willing to talk about it a little bit more than older people. And so, you can actually get into those meaningful conversations. And something you said, I really like, it's like every time, it's like meaningful and spiritual conversations can end in a natural point. Like it doesn't have to get to this like conclusion where there's repentance and asking Jesus into your heart, like every time, right? You can actually pick up a spiritual conversation later after it was put down naturally. And especially if you've already, like what you said, you have some relationship, you've talked about that topic already. You talk about family and some hard things came up, but then, hey, something else popped up and the conversation naturally ended. You can circle back to that some other time and it's natural and be like, man, I was thinking about that thing you told me that one time. And then boom, you're right back into a spiritual conversation. So just like, don't make it weird. Like you don't have to break all, that's what our friend Seth Bouchel always said. You don't have to break all conversation rules to have a spiritual conversation. Just be meaningful, like just be intentional, but don't be like, just chill out, like don't run the red light. For most of us, I would say we don't even know how to accelerate through green, though I find that more of an issue. But for some of us, we're like, dude, if it's a yellow, it's a red, just chill.
I mean, and it speaks to you as a person if you remembered a specific thing from a year ago that they shared with you. It's like not many people would do that. They wouldn't just pull back like the Rolodex of, their memory of you sharing that story or feeling like, I touched on something there. And like down the road, I would like to revisit that. And as a disciple maker, that's a really good skill to have, to revisit, to not just like have a bunch of conversations, forget them, which is going back to like the introvert where it's like, they may have a really high level capacity to remember specific details because they go, with less individuals, right? Where if you have too many, you can almost get into the space of like, I don't remember who I had that conversation with. Who was that? Like kind of deal. And that can also run a risk of like, are you just churning and burning? And that's not a healthy process to get into. But also, I mean, when you're talking, the other thing that God brought to mind was like, we study in Jesus is both descriptive, prescriptive way of evangelism, right? Where we're saying, hey, it's, prescriptive in the sense that he asks questions, but then we also study like singular stories, right? Of like the Samaritan woman at the well. And so sometimes like we try to do our best in translating, like slow down, like, cause like kids particularly think about disciple making in the span of one conversation, because that's what they read about in the Bible. They see Jesus interact with the Samaritan woman at the well, and boom, it just, oh my gosh, multiply the whole village now, and you're like, okay, slow down. Like we're talking years. You could be in the space of years of developing relationship with one person and praying for them to ever have an openness to even have a meaningful conversation. And so I think as humans, as Americans, we tend to think about the microwave, right? And trying to quickly get to things in every space of our life, not just spiritually, but anything. Right. And I think it's just really important that we slow down and we understand the slow cooker process, the smoker, if you will, of how to really navigate. And I think that just is true in relationships, friendships, and navigating disciple making through question asking and these things.
Dude, really good. Really important. Okay, I'm going to scroll down if you're still looking at this, and we're just going to look at three. I don't know how deep we'll dive into this, or maybe I'll just kind of run through it. And if you have any kind of color commentary, we try to make this like a tool. So all this teaching on conversations, how do we make it into like a practice for our trainings? And one thing that we've discovered is like, okay, let's actually practice coming up with some questions. So we use this FROG acronym, or as Brian corrects us, acrostic, and friends and family, recreation, occupation, goals, and gifts. And what we actually try to do is like, hey, actually think, and I did this last week with a ton of people in our house that we're training. And I was like, write down a casual question and then a meaningful or spiritual question that would fall under that general topic. So friends and family, and we give the example on this one. A casual one might be, tell me about your family, what's your home life? And then what you mentioned earlier, was your family involved in church as a kid, right? You're immediately, these are just questions that you have in the hopper ready to throw out to be a little bit more intentional. Do the same thing with recreation. Do the same thing with occupation and goals and gifts. And it really is, it's funny. It's, as people practice this, it's actually not weird at all. Like the questions that people come up with. So I don't know if you have anything to add with that, but that's just a good way
I would
to
just say
practice.
that we've put in our trainings, we'll put the students together in pairs and have them, like, person 1 is only allowed to ask questions of person 2, and we'll set a 5-minute timer and just see where you get, and then we'll flip it and the other person. And by and large, that helps a lot of the like debunking of how difficult this would be or all the fear that could be wrapped up in it. And we usually tell them you have to be with somebody who you don't know in the room, so there is some sense of getting to know them a little bit better. And they're, every time it's like, and we've trained over 450 high school kids on this. So like every single time they're like, that was not that hard.
That's crazy. I wish I would have heard you say that like last week before I did this, because that's so practical. And
well, it helps them actually, navigate like I can literally just be in a conversation and only ask questions. And that can be draining, if you're only
try.
You have to actually put forth effort. But they're like quickly surprised, or I think shocked, that it is not nearly as difficult as possible. And the only other thing I was going to add, like when we get to the spiritual space, when we walk with them, we go, because again, we have a good amount of data, because we ask every single time the teams gather as disciple makers in their high schools, we ask them if they've had any spiritual conversations. And then we follow up with any kids that say they have. And I think it's somewhere around 70 to 80% of the spiritual conversations that get brought up, they're brought up by the non-believer.
Interesting.
Not by the kid who is the disciple maker trying to invest in them. And so we're just like, you don't need to be this forceful, get it to the next stage, spiritual, topic like that. You don't have to force that element. But if you're naturally loving people well, they're going to ask you why. They're going to ask you more details as to, like, something's different about you. You remember that thing from a year ago? Like, we're now seniors in high school, and we had that conversation as sophomores. And you still remember that? Like, that's not normal. I don't have friends that care like that. Like, tell me, are you, I assume you're a Christian or have some spiritual background, which is a lot of what the stories they would share with us are, that they would kind of initiate.
Man, so really it's like we don't need to overthink this. I mean, as you're living on mission, that's really interesting statistic. Okay, just for the sake of time, we're going to go to our second. So it's a part 2 of our 3-part tool here. Is the idea of 15-second stories. And I think of this in 2 ways. One is, we sometimes call it like spiritual statements, like just things that we talk about the kingdom, we talk about God in these short snippets. And then there's even some more intentionality that comes with this particular tool, where we look at like there's a time when, that something was rough, something hard, something before God redeemed something. And then God, blank, like what did God do to change that hurt or that pain, or how did he show up? And then we look at, okay, now, like what has happened since, God kind of redeemed it. So it's like before, meaning God, and then now. And then we're not talking about, it doesn't have to be the 15-minute, like traditional testimony of how I came to get. It's like these little stories. How do you like walk with this with students? What fruit have you seen from this? Walk me through this one.
I would just say it's helpful, when we say 15-second, we don't time them or anything, but we do just go like, you should be able to say this fairly quickly, like, cause these are quick stories, and, Jesus is sanctifying us forever, and so we should have multiple instances where he's shown up in our life that changed something broken in us. And that may look like the moment where you decided I'm all in of salvation. Or it may look like a moment where you realized you were struggling with pride and arrogance, and you need to be able to do that. And so when we're training this, I always just share a bunch of different deep stories of transparency, because I go, why do you think people don't get to a level of spiritual? Like, if people want to talk about spirituality, but they don't, why is that? And I was just asking this to a student leadership team of a local church's youth group that we're training right now. And ultimately, what they all came to is, well, they don't trust the people that are spiritual. And so there's no relationship there because they've not invested the time and were willing to stick in it until they were at a space that they could even share anything about their own life and testimony.
Totally.
And so trust is a major thing that has to get built, and that only happens through time and patience.
Yeah.
And then you do have to have a space and time where you are going to give an answer as to why you follow Jesus.
Yeah.
Because if we don't know that, which a lot of high school kids don't, and helping them navigate that is incredibly important. I always say high school students because that's who I work with, but then I go, adults don't.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like, I just think maybe that's American Christians currently don't, right? Where we have a big struggle with actually knowing why we follow Jesus in the moments that he has redeemed in our lives, because he has. And sometimes we just don't note it. And this is a really healthy space to help them note it. And then the last thing I'll say on it is, I've also seen the power it does within the teams that we train, because, I was asking them, hey, how many of you knew each other's testimony? Like, we have them share them. We have them share one or two of their stories in front of the whole training.
Yeah.
Because we just go, if you can't share it here, you're gonna have a really hard time sharing it in a space that people don't follow Jesus. So like knowing how to share it here is a really safe space that you should be able to do this in. Yeah. But almost most of them that I ask, they've never shared it in any public format at all. And it's like, you're all from the same youth group, you're on a student leadership team, and you haven't yet shared this with each other. And so I think it creates also internally a way of knowing and hearing people's heart and the transparency behind their lives. And it's like, man, that's what leads people to also share transparently.
Dude, absolutely.
And so this is not about I'm sharing the glorifying moment of my life that was amazing. It's actually more about like, let's share the dark parts of our life, because that's what people who don't yet know Jesus want to hear and need to hear, because all they perceive is that you're this perfect version of something,
right?
Of this religious person who only follows the rules. And it's like, actually, you should hear the places I haven't followed the rules and all the brokenness that existed in my life, because that's how we want to identify with other people. And I always talk about too, like the addiction community and how good they are about sharing. There's no option. They're at the bottom of the barrel. And so it's like, I got no choice. This is where I'm at. This is where my addiction has gotten me to. And if you've ever been in those circles, the level of depth that they have with one another is crazy. Because they're willing to share the dark parts of their life. And I think the testimony, the stories are about, here's the darkness, here's the brokenness that proves honestly the original sin, right? Where it's like, we all are falling short. And I get to share that and show you that Jesus is that answer is so important for them to hear and be ready. Be ready when that comes up, and not to just throw it out awkwardly, right?
So good. It's disarming too, man. Like, I mean, that's what you're saying. It's like so disarming to share it, to be real, and to share hard things. People lean in way more when there's vulnerability. I love that. That's so different than like former evangelism practices. I think, at least in Western trainings, where it's like, say the good things, say what God's done, say how much life is perfect now, and it's like, no. Oh, we're going to glorify God and the fact that he shows up, but man, he shows up in the brokenness. All right. Last but not least, and this is super simple. It's funny. I've discovered this through the years, is like, sometimes when we have the spiritual conversations, people are really leaning in, our very natural invitation is to like, let's keep that journey going. Let's discover more about this thing we're talking about, this topic that's coming up about God. And I found that people get tripped up of like how to even word an invitation like that with somebody. So we do this just for like some like muscle memory practice. Like, it's not a script that you have to like throw out, but in those conversations, how would you invite someone to discover more about God via Discovery Bible Study settings? So we actually literally have people write that out. How would you word that? So if you're looking on the screen, you can see that's the last part. Is there something that you guys lean into in your 0 hour trainings, or is that pretty simple?
I think we just go like, first off, don't say Discovery Bible Study. Probably don't even say Bible study, because the normal mode of invitation is come to my church and hear more, and we're just going, well, actually, like you have amazing power to just sit with them and discover more, because they trust you. If you're at that space where you've built the relationship, they trust you. And so there's simple ways that you could ask them, and I think ultimately we just go, I think we try to coach them towards saying, it feels like you're interested in this. Is that is that accurate? You know, just almost asking the permission to say,
that's good. Yeah.
You know, because sometimes we go, we think there's a spiritual interest and we assume it immediately and invite them. Hey, would you want to read more about who Jesus is? You know, which is a great way of asking that as well. But on the front end of it, we just help and try to encourage them to say, ask them if there's a curiosity, an interest. Like if it's like, hey, we've been hanging for a while and like, you know, we've navigated some pretty deep things and you know who I am and what my faith is. And so I'd just be curious if you had any interest in that. And if not, that's okay too. Like I'm your friend, regardless of what you say. And I'm still going to be here. I just know it's an important piece to my life and would be curious if you'd ever be interested in that.
100%. So. Yeah, I think of our missionary pathway language. You know, we pray a lot. We live like people on mission. We plant the gospel. We start discovery settings. We see churches emerge. There's almost like these key moments where it doesn't work like this, but you transition from one phase to the other. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it feels like living on mission, transitioning into discovering Jesus together it's usually it's this part. It's this invitation to discover via talking about real things. So we just can't like go past it like it's nothing.
Skip it. Yeah.
At the same time, it's like you also don't have to overthink it. Yeah. Like it's just be a friend and be natural. And like no matter what we write down is how would you invite someone to discover more? Like in the end, it really kind of just looks like a natural conversation that you're already having with someone. Yeah. And then it might be around a specific topic. That's what I found a lot. Like let's like you might just reference a Bible story and like we could totally read that together and talk more about it. Whatever it is, it's natural. Sorry, I have a cold and I'm just like struggling.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But yeah, so let's dude, this is really good stuff. Really, really practical as we walk through the spiritual conversations tool on our pathway and in the toolkit. Again, you can get that at kcunderground.org/toolkit. Or you can get on a missionary pathway. Final thoughts that you would have to tie a bow on spiritual conversations?
I'd just say it's probably if not one of the only other things that is so unique to how we're walking and training people of how to live missionally is conversations and really investing relationally. And it's not the flashy, it's not the easy sold one because it's slow and it's really patient and it's so worth it. And I think will for anybody encourage them to feel like this is a more natural way of loving people and it feels honoring of them. And that's important. Yeah. I think the way that we go about evangelism should honor and love people and respect them and where they're at. And so I just, this included with Discovery Bible Study in the process of it are the two really unique pieces, of how you actually show people who Jesus is and how he's a part of your life. And so this void, like if you did this void of DBS, it probably wouldn't go, the way / the other way around. Yeah. If you didn't invest relationally and then just threw into a DBS, same thing. Totally. Where it's like, this is so much based in trust and transparency and relationship that they have to go together. Yeah. And they will feed one another in a really healthy way that will get you to really see and multiply disciples who will multiply other disciples.
That's right. Man, it's so good. Man, the Corys we're just fire, dude. Yeah. That's unbelievable. All right. Well, I think you have to actually end it on your screen. Okay. So, peace.